Group Policy and Group Policy Management Console. This nugget addresses group policy and how to work with that, which you may have worked with in Windows Server 2000 in the past, but which we're going to address again so that we can lay a foundation for Group Policy Management Console. We'll also look at some new things there as well. To begin with, you edit policies in the same basic method that you've always done in the past under Windows 2000. However, there are some new methods that you can use to refresh policy. Actually, there's a single new method, and it's going to be different than what you used in 2000. So we're not going to use SecEdit refresh policy anymore. We use a brand new method under Windows Server 2003 and Windows XP. There's also block policy inheritance, which we've always used in the past, as well as no override. Remember, block policy inheritance simply says that I don't want inherited policies to pass down to a specific OU, and no override says I don't care what you say, I want this specific policy to pass down anyway. Well, if you've got a lot of this going back and forth between your organizational units in your hierarchy, it gets very confusing, but you can straighten that out quickly with resultant set of policy so that you can determine what the bottom line is when a certain user logs onto a certain computer, exactly which policies they get. And then we'll look at the Group Policy Management Console and the basic functionality of how it works, and we'll introduce it so that we can use it again in our next nugget. Now, before we delve completely into policies, let's take a look at Active Directory users and computers, and I'll just notify you of some changes that have taken place since the last time you might have seen this. I've just added a couple of other cities here, and in Phoenix, which is where all of my resources are that we've been working with so far, I've added a computers OU and put in computer accounts here under desktops and kiosks and laptops and servers. So there's several different accounts that we could work with if we want to. I do have a client 01 that I'll be showing in our demonstrations for this nugget. And then I have user accounts, which are located underneath all of these departmental OUs that you see down here. And several of these we've seen in the past as well. For example, there's my sales OU with now new OUs inside of it, with inside sales and outside sales, as you see here. And we'll be logging on with this user account, sales01 here, also in just a moment. So let's take a look at what we can do with our group policies, and let's look at the desktop for a user account first. To do that, what I'm going to do is go to a remote desktop icon, which I've put down here on the quick launch area, but which is also available on the start menu under the communications menu. And then I'll just click this and click on connect. By the way, remote desktop allows me to connect to a desktop as if I was seated there locally, and it's just a way of remotely managing either users' computers or servers. And we do have a nugget later on which completely discusses this, but for the time being, just assume that I'm actually physically at that computer when we look at all this. So now I'll log on as this particular user, and we'll take a look at what management might want us to do here with our policies. So as we look at this desktop, we see, oh, it's this beautiful standard Windows XP desktop, which has kind of, you know, the verdant green meadow here and the Fisher-Price start menu and all that kind of stuff. And management says, we really love this wallpaper because it gives everyone a sense of well-being and world peace, and hopefully it'll cut down on employee complaints and dissatisfaction and all that kind of thing. So management wants to ensure that everybody can only use this wallpaper when they log on and that they cannot change it. So here's what management wants us to do. We'll go to Active Directory users and computers, and we'll go to the scope of management that addresses what kind of control we want to implement. By the way, you just heard me use a new term, scope of management. Microsoft in the past in their documentation has said Site Domain Organizational Unit, or SDOU. Now they say scope of management, or SOM, just so that you'll know what you're reading when you look at Microsoft documentation. To go to the policy there, we just simply right-click on the OU as you saw me do there, choose Properties, click the Group Policy tab, choose New if there's not something there already, and I'll just call this Phoenix Policies. Then you can double click on it or click the edit button. Either one does the same thing, which is to take you to the Group Policy Object Editor with a focus on the Phoenix Policies policy. Now what I want to do is to change the user's ability to change their wallpaper, so I'll go down here to Control Panel Display, and I see over here, Prevent Changing Wallpaper, and if I scroll over to the right, we see that it's not configured. In Windows XP and Windows Server 2003, we see that there's a new item over here on the left-hand side, which gives you the full description of what this policy does. It's the same thing that you would see if you were to double-click on this policy and click the Explain tab. Same information there. You can also go back to the standard Windows 2000 version by clicking the standard tab, just whichever suits you. So we'll go to this policy, choose Enabled, click OK. And by the way, when I click OK, it's turned on right now. There's no save as or anything like that. It's just on. And then we'll close this out. Now we'll go back to that user's desktop. Let me point something out here. When you turn on a policy, it's not always practical for you to tell all the users, okay, everyone, send out a broadcast email or something. Everyone log off and log back on again, especially if it's, 11 o'clock in the morning or something like that. So what you can do instead is, if it's a critical policy and you are at a user's desktop where you want them to be able to implement this policy right away, you can go to the policy or go to a command line and go to the run command and type GP update. And this actually, you can see it does it in a command line right here. GP update is new with Windows Server 2003 and Windows XP, and it's the equivalent of secedit /refresh policy. And then if you've used that in the past, you can refresh the computer policy or refresh the user policy. In this case, it does both user and computer policies. And now we see that we right-click here, choose Properties, Desktop, and now since we refresh that policy, you can see all the different things that they could choose, but now they can't. And so this user says, you know what, when I look at this verdant green meadow, it reminds me that my grass is really long at home and I'm supposed to mow it. And I don't like to be reminded of that all the time, because I get enough reminding of that at home as it is. So I want to change it to autumn. Oops, I keep clicking on it, but nothing happens. So what am I going to do? Nothing, because now the policy is enacted and the user can't do anything to change that. Now we use GP update to refresh the policy immediately, but if we hadn't done that, when would a user normally see these policies? Well, policies refresh between 90 to 120 minutes on all Windows XP and Windows 2000 computers on clients. This is, by the way, a little bit of a misconception that a lot of people have based on some Microsoft documentation, which says that the refresh takes place every 90 minutes with a 30-minute offset. That doesn't mean plus or minus 30 minutes. It's only 90 minutes plus 30 minutes. Anyway, so between 90 and 120 minutes, they get the refreshed policies. Otherwise, if they log off and log on again on Windows 2000 computers, they will download the policies, because the network initializes, it sends their user credentials across the network, and it checks for any policy updates from the domain controller. If there's a version increment, then it will say, hey, there's a new policy, download it to the Windows 2000 professional computer. With Windows XP, it's different, because XP does not check the domain controller immediately. Instead, if the user's logged onto that computer anytime in the past, it will use cached credentials that are local. Then the user sees their desktop and they start working, and then at some point a few seconds after that, the network initializes and makes contact with the domain controller. Then if it sees their new policies, it will download them, but depending on the policy, the user might not get that policy immediately, because there's some policies that cannot take effect until the user logs off and logs back on again. And if that's the case, the user will have to log off and log on for a second time before they can get that new policy. If you don't like the cached credentials behavior with Windows XP, you can go to Active Directory users and computers and change that behavior. Let me just quickly show you where that is. I would do it on a domain basis. I wouldn't do it on a single OU basis, but you'd go to the policy, wherever the scope of management is that you want it to run. And I'll just use the default domain policy to show it to you here. Go to Administrative Templates, and then you'll go to System, Log On. Then here it says, always wait for a network at computer startup and log on, and it's not configured. Just go ahead and double click this and enable it, and that way it will initialize the network at startup and log on, download any new policies before the user gets the desktop, and you're good. Now with policies, there's also an inheritance in the scope of management. We said site, domain, and organizational unit, but there's actually another one, and that is local policy, which you can edit by going to a command prompt and typing in gpedit.msc. Doing that will edit local policies on the local computer only, does not affect other domains or organizational units. In any case, so it's local site, domain, and organizational unit in the scope of management, which follows an order of inheritance. So for example, the policy that I just set at nuggetlab.com flows down to all these OUs, flows down to Phoenix, for example, flows down to all these computers, flows down to the desktops, client 1, which is where we have our user logged on. This is important because if you have delegation of control to a specific administrator that only manages these desktops, for example, and they look at the policies on the desktops, they'll go and they will not see any policy that has any effect on those cached credentials. However, it is effective on the domain level. So those administrators can get confused and saying, hey, how come we're having a slower logon with all these clients because they are all waiting for cached credentials, because we don't have that policy set here. If we go to Properties, Group Policy, we don't even have any policies. Well, the fact of the matter is it's receiving them in the inheritance level. Now, let me show you a new thing about Windows Server 2003. Now, if you happen to be the person that's administering this desktop's OU and you can't figure out why all these clients have a slower logon, which we know is because we're forcing them to wait for the network to start up and log on because of this domain policy, then you can say, how come this client's taken so long to log on? And really, it's not that long. It's just marginally longer, but we can take a look at why that might be. Number one, we could go to that actual client and log on to it, and then from a command prompt, and even users can do this, you don't have to be an administrator, from a command prompt type rsop.msc, which is also available in the Help and Support Center on a Windows XP computer or a Windows Server 2003 computer, and then it will analyze your policies. It's a real simple interface, HTML interface to navigate through, and it shows you what the policy results are. The other thing you could do is you could go to result instead of policy here on the Active Directory users and computers where it says logging, and then you can click on that and it will tell you what will happen with the policies if I'm on this computer, which I had already selected, and then I can specify which user. By the way, it only allows you to select users who have logged on to that computer in the past. So if there was a sales 02 user, I could not predict what would happen with that user here because they had never logged on to it before. But sales 01 has, and that's the one I'm interested in right now, so I'll click just the next finish wizard, and we'll wait for it to do its thing. Then when it says it's finished here, we'll click on Finish, and it opens up what looks like a policy editor, but if you look at the top, it says Resultant Set of Policy. The advantage of this is, instead of double-clicking my way through an actual group policy to find all the settings that might or might not be set, this will only show me settings that are either enabled or disabled. And under Administrative Templates, for example, notice that it only is going to show me the control panel item and the display node, and then it shows me right over here, prevent changing wallpaper enabled. And we'll go to the standard view so we can possibly see a little bit better. And you can see that right there. Even tells me exactly which policy is making that happen. So we see how that affected the user configuration of this particular user on this client. Now let's go back to our original topic of the cached credentials issue. That would appear under the computer configuration under System, Log On. And here we have, always wait for the network at computer startup and log on, and that's the policy we just configured earlier, and it shows us that's because of the default domain policy. Now there's another thing you can do as well here, and that is to be able to do planning, resultant set of policy planning. Let's take a user account to check that out. You can do it with user or computer accounts, but let's just say this sales 01 user account. I want to know what would happen if I would move this user into just the generic users container here. Now the users container here and the computer's container here cannot have policies applied to them like you can to an OU. So you can't supply separate policies, although they do inherit policies from the site or the domain. In any case, in this Inside Sales user account, I want to right-click on it and say, what would happen if I were to move them to the user's container? So I'll go to Resultant Set of Policy Planning. I'm going to leave the computer configuration information as it is, so I won't change any of the containers or anything like that. Then I'll show slow network connection. This is important because certain policies don't actually apply on slow connections. For example, if I'm dialed in from a hotel room and I got a 24K connection speed, I don't want it to process the policy of installing applications because I don't want to install Microsoft Office over a 24K line. Then there's also loopback processing, which will control how policies take place on the user side of things. For example, there's two kinds. There's merge mode, which will take the user node policies and apply them as usual, nothing unusual there, but it also adds any user node policies that are applied to a container that contains computer accounts, for example. So then what happens is the user gets a user node setting twice. There's also replace, which means that it would ignore the user's normal user node policies and only use the policies from the user node on a policy that contains that computer account. And you can change the site here, as you can see as well. So here's where I want to get to what I really want to do, and that is, what if I wanted to move this user to the user's container here, and then I just click OK here. It gives me the security memberships for that particular user. Next, here it gives me an opportunity to choose any linked filters that have gone on. WMI, Windows Management Instrumentation, is the ability to analyze machines for certain kinds of information. For example, using WMI, I can run this only on computers that have X number of gigabytes of hard drive space, or running a specific operating system, or something like this. So that's what WMI is. We don't have any filters configured in our environment at all, so we'll just skip past that. And then this is just a summary of everything we've selected. And then we'll click Finish, and it shows me the resultant set of policy. Now, the important thing to notice with this is that when I go to Windows settings down here under User Configuration and Software Settings, there's really nothing here. The security settings are all inherited from the domain, but remember the policy that we set up originally on this particular user in that OU? Because we went to the Phoenix OU and we set up the enforced policy that would not allow people to change their wallpaper. Notice that this user doesn't have any of those settings, because that would appear under administrative templates, which does not even appear in resultant set of policy here. So what's the bottom line? You move this user to the user container, and they do not get that policy that prevents them from changing their wallpaper. There are a couple of other policy items that are pretty important here, and that is the block policy inheritance and the no override settings. First, let's go to this inside sales item, and let's say when we go here, we go to the group policy item. Now, there's no group policy listed here, but remember, it's inheriting policy from Phoenix, and that's where we stole away everybody's ability to change their desktop wallpaper. Well, let's say that the sales department here is pretty upset about that, and we've got high turnover there, and so we want to make them as happy as we can. So we've decided to give them back their constitutional right to have the freedom of expression. So what we can do here is to go to this block policy inheritance checkbox. We check that box and then click OK. Then when we go into their desktop settings here, we can refresh the policy again. Once that policy refreshes, we can then go back into their policy or their desktop settings, go to the desktop, and now we see that once again, they can choose any wallpaper that they want to choose. Well, now the CEO goes by the sales department and he walks by these users' desktops and he sees that everybody's got, wallpapers of their kids and their kitty cat and their little dog and their puppies and all that kind of stuff. And he says, "Hey, what's all this? We can't have that kind of individual expression here. We're cold and corporate." So what I want to do is to make sure that everybody gets that setting, even if an administrator down here is rogue and goes to that block policy inheritance item. I don't want that to be something that can prevent that policy from passing down. So what we can do here then is go to the administrators of the Phoenix OU where the policy originated for the wallpaper setting, which is what we set in the Phoenix policies, and we can go to options here, and then we can say no override, and this will prevent that block policy inheritance setting. So we click that, then go back to this user's desktop. Again, we'll refresh the policy there, and we'll see now that when they right click and they choose properties, that they go to the desktop item, and once again, they're blocked from being able to change this. And we'll take a look at what happens there. Even though this administrator down here in inside sales has chosen block policy inheritance, further up the hierarchy at Phoenix, they chose that you could not block policy inheritance by selecting the no override option. Now, the reason I bring up this block policy inheritance and the no override option is not because you may not already be aware of it, but because this can get really complicated. I mean, on certain levels you have block policy inheritance. On certain other levels you have no override. And so by the time you get down here to this poor inside sales item, if it's gotten pretty complex up and through here, and by the way, as smart administration, you shouldn't let it get that complicated. But if it does, man, by the time you get down here, you might have no earthly idea what kind of settings these users are going to get. And that's where the resultant set of policy for logging and planning can really come in handy, because it can tell you exactly where the policies come from. Now, so far we've only edited policies using the standard group policy editor that we had in Windows 2000. It's pretty much the same. There is a new tool that you can use. It's actually a console that you can install. It's called the Group Policy Management Console, or GPMC. Go to Microsoft's website and go to the Windows Server 2003 section and download GPMC.msi. It's just a next finish wizard, so I won't belabor that by showing it to you. Anybody can install it. And once you've installed it, it will add to the administrative tools portion of the start menu this group policy management item. However, also if you go to Active Directory users and computers and you start to edit a policy, for example right here, and go to group policy, it replaces this interface where we used to have the policies and all the settings that we could configure with this new item which says to open group policy management, click Open. And of course you do it here, and it opens it up just the same way as if we had opened it from the Start menu in Administrative Tools. The only difference here is it also opens on the focus of wherever you happen to be when you right-click and chose Properties and went to the Group Policy tab. But we'll just shrink all this up for now. So this gives us a look at our entire environment. It's a little bit different because the Group Policy Management Console starts at a forest level, and it allows you to see everything from within the same forest. In fact, if you have a large enterprise or multiple forests in your environment, you can even add additional forests into the console. And to do that, all you'd have to do is to right-click on Group Policy Management Console, choose Add Forest, and then specify the name of the domain in that forest that you want to manage. In our case, we only have the one forest, so that's all we'll work with for now. Now as it goes to actually editing policy, you'll do some things a little bit differently. For example, when we look at the Phoenix OU, notice that underneath that appears the policies itself. And when you click on it, it gives you a little message here. And basically what it's saying is that you can change this, and it's actually going to make global changes, not just changes to the Phoenix OU, but to everything. This is not new in Windows Server 2003. The same would have happened under Windows 2000, because remember, these policies can be linked anywhere. Even though I named this Phoenix Policies, let's say it's got a couple dozen settings in there that we really like and that work very well for us. Let's say somebody in the Los Angeles office says, hey, I see you put a lot of effort into that. I think I'll borrow it. Well, all they have to do then is to right-click here and to link an existing GPO. And they could do a similar function in the old version of editing group policy, which is without the Group Policy Management Console. And they could say, I want to find this Phoenix Policies group policy, click OK, and now we'll see that Phoenix Policies also applies to the Los Angeles office. Of course, if you decide you don't want the Phoenix Policies item linked to the LA organizational unit, you simply right-click the policy, choose Delete, and when you do that, by the way, it doesn't delete the policy itself, it just does not link it to LA anymore. So it will not have any effect there any longer. You can also go down here to the security filtering. This shows you who the policy applies to by default. It always applies to authenticated users. So that means anybody who's had their credentials validated by the domain controllers. And the authenticated users will then read, and they will also apply group policy. If you want to look at the more specific security settings for a policy, you can right-click over here on the policy itself, choose Edit, then up at the top on the Phoenix Policies focus, go to Properties, then go to Security, and it shows you exactly who the policy applies to in various respects. And again, there's authenticated users, read, and apply group policy permissions. Other accounts, such as the system account, domain admins, all those administrator kind of accounts, can read the account, of course, and which makes sense because they have to be able to read it and edit it, but they don't have the apply group policy, so these policies don't take effect. Also, I mentioned WMI filtering a little bit earlier, Windows Management Interface filtering, and this is the ability to apply the policy on various criteria according to the system, the computers themselves, such as I might want it to only apply to computers with a certain amount of hard drive space, or to those that have a certain service pack or version of Windows, and so forth. Now let's go look at some other items. Up here at the top we have the Details item. We won't exhaust this in great detail, but most of this is pretty obvious. However, you can see one thing that's interesting here. That's the unique ID. This is the unique ID for that particular policy. If you look through the file system for the policy, you won't see something that's called Phoenix Policies. You have to identify it by this unique ID. The GPO status, this is another place where you can change how it applies. Under old Group Policy Editor, you can make the same changes, but it's just in a different fashion. Here you can say all settings disabled, to completely disable the policy, of course. Computer configuration settings disabled, which means that only the user configuration settings would apply then. You can also use enabled, which is the default setting, and then user configuration settings disabled, meaning that only the computer settings would apply. When you click on settings, this is just an item that you receive because we're working with Windows Server 2003, which has certain security precautions already built into it. We'll just close this. It just gives you a little warning there. And this tells me what policies actually are part of the Phoenix Policies. This is real handy because in the past, you'd have to double-click and open the policy itself, and you'd be editing around in here. And there are about 600 policies. And you don't know what policies are in there, so you find yourself expanding every little thing until you finally, hopefully, find a policy that's enabled. Well, here it just tells you right off the bat exactly what's enabled, and it gives it to you in HTML interface, so it's very readable, and the reports pretty easy to read. And then finally, if you want to save this report, all I have to do is to right-click on it and choose Save Report. It saves it as an HTML file, and I'll just save it on the desktop for the time being. And you'll see out here that now I have it in an HTML file, and it just opens it up to me. This way I can click Show All, and it gives me some of the particulars that we looked at earlier, and more importantly, the actual setting that is enabled. And it gives you even a hyperlink for it so that you can get the explanation for that particular policy. Now, returning to the Group Policy Management Console, we see that there's also a Delegation tab here. Don't confuse this with the Delegation of Control wizard. I think they probably should have just put the word permissions or security permissions or something on here instead, because that's all this is really showing you is security permissions on the particular GPO. It's not the same as Delegation of Control over an OU, which is where you right-click on the OU and start the Delegation of Control wizard to give a user or group varying degrees of access or control over a specific OU. Of course, if you need to add anybody, you can do that through the Add button down here, or you can use the Advanced button to also manage the users and groups that are in this list. In this nugget, we addressed group policy and the Group Policy Management Console. First, we edited a simple policy that prevented people from being able to change their wallpaper, and they can still see other wallpapers, they just can't select them, so the joke's kind of on them with that particular policy. And then we talked about how to refresh the policy, because by default, the systems will refresh their own policy for most policies within 90 to 120 minutes, but you can also manually update that policy by using GP Update, which replaces SecEdit refresh policy that we used to use under Windows 2000. Then we looked at block policy inheritance and no override, which simply controls whether or not policies are inherited by OUs and sub-OUs and so forth. And if this whole scenario gets pretty complicated, or if you have a lot of policies that accumulate and you're not sure what the resultant settings are going to be, you can use the resultant set of policy, which is an MMC console, and it's available through the HTML pages of your help system, and you can launch it from there, or you can just type rsop.msc from a command line, and this will help you to analyze what the bottom line effects are going to be. Then we looked at the Group Policy Management Console and how to use it, and this also lays the foundation for the next nugget, which talks about backup, restore, copy, and importing group policies. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.